In my review of Titan Souls, I've mentioned how a lot of retro-inspired indie games tend to be set in worlds that attempt to have a quasi-mythic quality about them, a world reduced to ruin or at best set just before the end times. And Narita Boy is once again a game that tries to do the same, at least to a certain extent. However, it's not entirely set in a fictional world removed from our own. This is where Narita Boy actually employs another common aspect of many indie titles, which is that a lot of them like to set themselves inside a digital space like a simulation or an in-world video game. At the start of the game, after it sets up the inciting incident, the protagonist gets sucked into his computer where the rest of the adventure ends up taking place. The world you get to explore is referred to as the Digital Kingdom, even by its inhabitants, who all have heads like CRT monitors and frequently speak in fairly technical jargon. I'm sure that to many creatives in the indie space, incorporating things about computers into their games' narrative seems like a logical thing to do, since it combines their passion for creating video games with their passion for the technology that allows them to create the video games in the first place. However, at this point, it's decidedly not novel or unique anymore to have a computer program character talk about source code as if it's some holy scripture or something like that. Because at this point I've seen enough attempts to incorporate computer terminology and programming concepts into video games to where I honestly feel like it's just too lazy to do if you're not trying to use this aspect of your world building in novel ways. And Narita Boy unfortunately doesn't do that. In fact, much of the narrative during gameplay is largely removed from what the story segments of the game are about. That inciting incident I mentioned earlier goes as follows. A schlubby looking dude called Lionel is sitting in front of his Macintosh in the 1980s in a city that for some reason is called Old York. Because of course, a game that takes place inside a computer rendered in pixel graphics is set in the 1980s, so it gets to make liberal use of Tron's neon light show color palette. I mean, if they're ripping off the concept of living computer programs, they might as well go the extra mile and leave no ambiguity where the inspiration came from. While Lionel is happily coding away, Lionel's computer somehow gets taken over by a self-aware program called him, who somehow causes Lionel to lose his memory, which for some reason causes him to get insanely powerful and threatens the Digital Kingdom. The goal of the narrative is to travel the Digital Kingdom to restore Lionel's memories and defeat the Stallions, him's evil computer programs that have invaded various locales of the Digital Kingdom before taking on him himself. While that's straightforward enough, there's unfortunately not a lot to the story taking place inside the Digital Kingdom. Like I said in the beginning, the game is fond of using flowery exposition that tries to give the world a lived-in and quasi-mythic feeling sense of tangibility, but much of the dialogue completely undermines this with the overly techy way it's written that never lets you fully immerse yourself in this world or the plight of the programs you encounter. I assume every humanoid-looking being you see is supposed to be a computer program, but as so often, trying to make sense of a computer program as an anthropomorphized being eventually breaks down if you think about it too hard. I mean, why do computer programs need a pub to wind down after work? And what does that pub even serve? Cookies? Stuff like this always niggles at the back of my mind when I encounter media like this, and as a result I end up not really empathizing with any of the virtual characters if not enough work has gone into making me forget that these are just ones and zeros in more than one sense. Then again, the story that's being told here is mostly not about the Digital Kingdom or its plight, it's more about Lionel and the things he's forgotten. While traversing the various locations of the Digital Kingdom, you can encounter a bunch of totems, each of which unlocks another memory. Opening the totems allows you to enter those memories, which are key scenes from Lionel's life since early childhood. And I have to say, much of what's in those scenes is really effective. The combination of the mostly freeze-framed scenes and the narration by Lionel himself, coupled with the beautiful music, manages to give these moments a gravity that I haven't seen in a lot of other games. Mostly because it also deals with rather mature concepts like child abandonment, alcoholism, spousal estrangement and divorce, as well as parenthood. It gets a bit goofy at some point when Lionel becomes the leader of a religious cult while being indoctrinated by a previous attempt of him taking over, but honestly, at times it was shockingly effective storytelling. Unfortunately, pretty much none of the narrative or its themes are represented in the Digital Kingdom, where the threat of the Stallions is never used as a parable to whatever the memory you are unlocking next is about. From a gameplay perspective, there's not much to say about Narita Boy. It's a fairly basic hack and slash with a bit of platforming thrown in for good measure. The main combat mechanic is pretty enjoyable, and it's fun to figure out each enemy's moveset, strengths and weaknesses when you first encounter them. However, the farther the game progresses, the more you have to fight waves upon waves of the same enemies you've already dealt with, only in greater numbers. And when even the most basic enemy takes 4 or 5 slashes to dispose of, the fights can end up feeling drawn out for no reason. There are ways to speed up fights when enemies later on get color-coded, and if you enable the wildfire of the same color, it allows you to deal a lot more damage to the enemies of the same color, but it also comes with the downside that these enemies also deal much more damage to you. So if you end up in a situation where you're surrounded by a ton of enemies, 1 or 2 hits from one of the color-coded ones could spell almost instant death that can be avoided by simply not using the wildfire and drawing out the fights. Honestly, if ever a game needed some kind of progression system that reduces the number of hits it takes to take out enemies from earlier in the game, it's this one. I also feel that the health system is in need of a general overhaul. There's no traditional health pickups in Narita Boy. The only way you can get back health is through a segmented bar that gets filled up whenever you strike an enemy. Once a segment is full, which takes quite a few strikes, you can use the segment to get a single health point back. That would be fine enough if there were other means of getting back health as well. Because for one, that bar fills way too slowly to be useful during combat. And for two, that segmented bar isn't just there to get back health, it can also be used to summon helpers to clear out the screen whenever you're having trouble with any given wave of enemies. So it's a trade-off between a screen clearing bomb or getting a health point back. The problem arises whenever you get out of a fight and only have a few health points left. If you continue and enter another fight, chances are you're going to run out of health if you don't manage to dodge everything perfectly. But since the game auto-saves after pretty much every fight, the best strategy when you only have a few hit points left is to just die on purpose. That way you just respawn after the last save with full health. The obvious solution here would have been to either refill your health automatically after every fight, to introduce health pickups, or to have the segments fill faster and restore more health upon use. But other than that, there's not much to say about the combat. The number of abilities expands at a decent pace, and some are even needed to bypass certain roadblocks. In fact, seeing that initially made me feel like I was going to be playing a Metroidvania. I mean, looking at a clearly breakable wall that I don't have the ability to get through yet almost instantly sends me the signal that I'm supposed to explore something else first and come back once I found the ability that lets me bypass that wall. And honestly, I would have liked Narita Boy more if it had actually leaned harder into being the Metroidvania it clearly wanted to be. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of freedom to go wherever you please. The whole affair is pretty linear from start to finish. That doesn't mean that the game isn't fond of letting you backtrack across cleared out screens to get to the other end of the map, to retrieve a key that opens the door that you're currently trying to get through. Not at all. I guess my main complaint here is that since it's not that much of a Metroidvania, the forced backtracking feels rather pointless. As do many screens that contain neither enemies, characters to talk to, platforming challenges, or environmental storytelling and only serve to drag out the runtime. That lack of non-linearity also frustrated me at a certain point when I realized that I hadn't gotten one part of the unlock key for the first memory in one of the regions and I couldn't go back to that region once I quote-unquote completed it. It's not a vital memory to the narrative, and as far as I can tell there's no alternate ending that gets unlocked afterwards, but I just felt kinda cheated when one of the first things the game sets up is this apparently special memory that you can just lock yourself out of getting when passing through points of no return. Speaking of the ending, I personally felt that the game didn't need the cliffhanger it ends on to claim that the story is to be continued. The narrative is already on shaky ground as it is, since much of the stuff happening in the digital world didn't relate to Lionel's memories at all. So how would the advertised continuation of the story serve the narrative instead of just having it naturally conclude once you've beaten the adventure? Not everything needs to be a franchise these days. It could have just given you a final resolution. If you want to continue making games set in this world, just set up a new inciting incident instead of promising a sequel that you won't know you'll even be able to deliver. If it seems like I'm down on Narita Boy after having criticized it so much, let me assure you that I don't dislike it. My problem with Narita Boy is that I see a lot of unrealized potential. Visually, the game is stunning, even though a couple of accessibility options to reduce all the flashing lights would have been nice for people with photosensitivity issues. I mean, you already implemented a way to turn off the glitchy CRT view, so just tone down the flashing lights while you're at it. And just like the visuals, the soundtrack is really cool. It has some downright synthwave bangers in there. Overall, I did enjoy my time with Narita Boy, both because of the surprisingly effective story of Lionel, as well as the pretty enjoyable gameplay. gameplay. What I wished was that the same amount of polish that went into the visuals and the soundtrack could have gone into fleshing out the narrative and its themes to incorporate them into the digital kingdom, enable more freeform player exploration to make it the proper Metroidvania it should have been, and maybe tweak the combat a bit instead of relying on the many multi-wave battles that happen during later stages that don't feel substantially different from the ones earlier in the game, only more drawn out due to the increase in the number of enemies they spawn.
The red people have gone crazy. They attack the digital world. What we need